A state-owned bank, a state-owned mill, a state-owned elevator. How did these seemingly socialist organizations come to be in the heart of the United States? The quiet prairies of North Dakota seemed an unlikely place for an economic and social revolution. But in 1914, after decades of exploitation by out-of-state business, the spark was struck, which ignited the political prairie fire known as the Nonpartisan League.
Production funding for the rise and fall of the Nonpartisan League is provided in part by the North Dakota Humanities Council, a nonprofit independent state partner of the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Minnesota Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund, with money from the vote of the people of Minnesota on November 4th, 2008, and by the members of Prairie Public.
To explain why the Nonpartisan League happened, I think you really have to begin with this conundrum that is North Dakota. On the one hand, you have this incredible landscape, this sea of grass that is just waiting for the plows to come. And you've got a territorial government along with the railroads who are boosting the Dakotas like crazy. Come to North Dakota. Come and get your farm going here. Here's a place really to live a great life as a farmer. On the other hand, it didn't quite work out that way for most of the farmers.
Then they started doing the math. They knew that the grain traders were taking money out of the system that they didn't earn. And that really boiled their hides. I mean, they were angry about that. And if you spoke at all negatively about the railroads, you didn't get cars. They would punish you. They saw those special interests, the Minneapolis Chamber of Commerce, the railroads and the grain traders, and then the bankers as their primary enemies and the people who were exploiting them. Nothing's more dangerous than a smart person who recognizes who's exploiting them.
But after decades of unsuccessful attempts to gain control of their financial future, North Dakota farmers had had enough. In 1914, 80% of North Dakota voters approved a law to build a state-owned mill run by North Dakota Farmers Equity that would finally free them from the grip of the Minneapolis Chamber of Commerce.
People flock to Bismarck thinking, we're going to see history made. We're going to see history made when the state finally does something to help the farmer, when the state is not run exclusively by big biz. The balconies are filled with farmers. Everybody wants to see this particular bill passed because it's the delivery. Things are going to be great.
But when the measure came to the floor, the unthinkable happened.
It doesn't pass.
The farmers just go berserk. They see red. It's obvious where this came from because the Minneapolis Chamber of Commerce and others had been fighting this thing tooth and nail. Slanderous attacks on the equity. There was even an equity convention in Fargo at one point where there's nearly a riot between Chamber of Commerce men and elevator supporters. So they've had their hands involved in the legislature. And it finally gets to a point where a conservative Republican legislator with the wonderful name of Treadwell Twitchell, and he makes this statement, according to Twitchell himself, he said, well, we've had enough time discussing this today. It's time for all of us farmers to go home and slop the hogs. All right, well, the equity leaders, they used it in a different way, that instead Twitchell had condescendingly told the farmers, you need to go home and slop the hogs. You don't mess around in these state affairs. You're not sophisticated enough. You're not smart enough to deal with this. And what happened at that moment is that there was a great campaign slogan for what was about to happen, and that was the Nonpartisan League.
Instead of going home and slopping the hogs, former socialist organizers A.E. Bowen and A.C. Townley went back to a Bismarck hotel room and outlined a plan to break the chokehold of the Minneapolis Chamber of Commerce, using the only organization with enough power and money to stand up to it: North Dakota's state government.
They knew they couldn't create the railroads. That took a lot of investment. But they believed that they could create a state-owned Bank of North Dakota that would be financed by the state's general fund, essentially. The taxes that were collected from the political subdivisions, the state income taxes, would all go into the Bank of North Dakota and would be used to run the bank as well as to finance real estate loans, loans to farmers, through the Bank of North Dakota. The thing that we know about farming is it's an industry where you have very little control. You have the weather, which you've got no control over. You have the banking interests and the costs of interest itself, which you've got no control over. You've got the grain elevators and the railroads, which you've got no control over. They were still competing on an international market even then, which they had no control over. The prices that they got for the grain and the cost of their seed, they had no control over. And so the idea that they could take control over some of these questions that affected their livelihood, it was a fabulous idea.
In February 1915, Townley and Bowen showed up at the home of Equity leader Fred Wood to convince him to back their plan against all the politicians under the control of the Chamber of Commerce. They proposed to take over the Republican Party.
You have Elbert Bowen, Arthur Townley, Fred Wood, John Hagan, and a few others coming together in a farmhouse outside of Deering, North Dakota, and essentially drafting the organizational documents that will incorporate the Nonpartisan League. And from there, immediately purchasing automobiles and sending out organizers, almost literally. Well, it didn't exactly happen that way. But the power of that myth was crucial. The notion that farmers could get together in a farmhouse and figure out how to take over state government, and then within a year and a half be successful at doing so. Wow, that's a story of empowerment.
From that kitchen in Deering, the Nonpartisan League spread like wildfire under the watchful eye and iron control of League President Arthur C. Townley.
Townley becomes the person that both leaguers and opponents center their energies on. And Townley becomes the powerful personality that shapes the movement. And of course, his abilities to see potential and to expand and his relentless drive to put the Nonpartisan League over become clear markers of that movement.
Sometimes politics are led by charismatic leaders. And you had in A.C. Townley a charismatic leader, someone who knew how to organize. Someone who had been a Socialist Party organizer but had been fired by the Socialist Party in North Dakota, who decided that this is still a good idea. And that's what Townley was able to sell them. That's what he was able to convince them. He forgot all about the Socialist Party once they fired him, but he didn't forget about the ideas.
The first organizers for the Nonpartisan League who start to fan out across North Dakota, they had a lot going in their favor. First of all, the farmers were plenty mad at what had happened with the attempt to get this state-owned grain elevator. But they've got some other stuff working in their favor as well. North Dakotans already, even though it was a young state, they had a lot of state pride. But the fact of the matter is most of the money that's getting stolen from them, or most of the money they feel rightfully belongs to them, is ending up in pockets in Minnesota.
Before 1915, candidates for state office were handpicked by agents of the Chamber of Commerce behind closed doors at a party convention. That was all going to change because in 1916, North Dakota would hold its first direct primary election.
The farmers are getting together in grange halls and town halls and one-room schoolhouses, and for the first time in their lives, they are now a part of participatory democracy. They are choosing together who is going to represent them in the halls of power in Bismarck.
The League's approach was absolutely unique. Instead of organizing as a third party, they would use the new primary system to take over the Republican Party.
If we think about the rank and file, and we think about the ways that they're thinking and the things that they're trying to articulate, and they're not getting that chance. They're being defeated at every turn. Figuring out what their perspective is brings a new kind of richness to the story. It was an avenue to politics. It was a way to move from thinking, oh, those people, they've got nothing to do with us, they don't listen to us. Those people in Bismarck, those people in St. Paul, those people in Helena, they don't care about us. They're not listening to me. You move from that position and way of thinking to, we can solve this problem. First of all, there's a we, and that is farmers as a class are organized. The very motto of the Nonpartisan League, we'll stick. If we can stick together as an occupational class and affect political change, well, then we've done it. We get what we want.
Staying true to its promise to be farmers for the farmers, the League's first slate of candidates was almost all farmers. Chief among them was candidate for governor Lynn Fraser, a successful potato farmer from Hoople, North Dakota, and a man ready to stand up in a tough political fight.
You know, I look at Lynn Fraser, and the guy played football at UND. He was in the line. They had no helmets, no face mask. Those guys, they were tough.
Despite his lack of political experience, one factor that qualified Fraser as a candidate for governor was his unblemished character.
They called him the gentleman from North Dakota, and this was especially out in Washington, D.C., because he was a man of great manners and very civilized individual. He was a very sober man, pretty religious man, but he doesn't appear to be a political innovator or an economic policymaker at all until he is suddenly cast in this role of governor.
Fraser was joined on the League ticket by other thoughtful, politically astute UND graduates. Although Townley kept an iron hand on the League's management, Fraser and the others played an important role in crafting how the League's agenda would be implemented.
That group of UND graduates, I think, furnished the brain trust that led to the specific legislative programs and proposals that the League came up with.
For the League's plan to work, they needed members. Lots and lots of members. Townley's innovative campaign tactics were designed to grab attention and appeal to farmers.
It was really a word-of-mouth grassroots effort. Once Townley got a few other people involved in organizing with him, they went out in Model Ts. That was the brilliant thing, is that the automobile still very much was young in terms of its impact on the nation at the time by 1915, but you send a bunch of guys around in Model Ts just visiting with farmers, interacting face to face. That's the best way to spread this message at the time.
A car pulls in the driveway. This might be the first car that some folks have seen, or else they've never had a chance to touch anyway. And he's willing to take the kids for a ride, the wife for a ride, and then after a while you settle down and you start talking. And he usually tried to find out who the local leader in the community was. You know, was it a certain grain farmer? Was it a certain mill elevator operator? And he'd pony up with this guy and they would drive around and you'd see Townley with the town leader. And as the one commentator said, you get around him and you talk hogs, you talk alcohol, you talk whatever until you've essentially worn him down. And then he'll sign his name on the contract to be a member of the NPL. I've always wondered if people signed it to get rid of him or if they signed it because they had been finally persuaded. The whole idea of taking a town leader, a community leader with this interesting new toy, Model T, caught people's attention.
A membership in the Nonpartisan League included a subscription to its popular newspaper, The Nonpartisan Leader.
And that was one of the cool benefits of membership in the NPL. It's like, you pay us $6 a year to belong to this nonpartisan league. Hey, you get a newspaper. So you get something tangible for your membership dues. The Nonpartisan Leader was a very influential paper in the state and a very important tool for the league to get its message out. Because this was at a time where, radio was very much in its infancy, had yet to really come on the national stage as a media. So it was print media where people got their information. What better way than to have a paper that's going to get your message out as an organization, as well as have other informative articles dealing with farming methods, Townley's speeches in the paper and other articles. It's just a great organ to get the message across to farmers. One of the things I really love about the Nonpartisan Leader, though, as a paper, is its brilliant use of cartoons, political cartoons.
Arthur Townley recognizes the significance of cartoons and directs the editors of the Leader to feature cartoons front and center. Well, first, Hiram Rube, or Hi, I'm a Rube, which is Bayer's first character, and at the 1916 League convention in Fargo, he actually comes out onto the stage dressed as the character he was drawing in the Nonpartisan Leader. And farmers just go crazy, they just love it, because it's sending up the people who are sending them up. It's saying, you can call me a Rube, but I'm going to claim it as my own and show you what we're going to do with it. Bayer, this very skilled cartoonist, is able to create ways of seeing to go with ways of thinking, or ways of seeing that represent ways of thinking, and the farmers identify with it right away. In contrast, you have the exact opposite. You have, in their fancy clothes, with kind of a devious nature, Big Biz. And that's a caricature too, and an equally problematic one. It was deployed visually and deployed in League rhetoric, whether it was in the newspaper or used by lecturers. And it was a very kind of simplified way of understanding farmers' problems, because they were intensely complicated between credit and grain grading and transporting the grain and not having any of that value to the grain added within the state boundaries of North Dakota. To just paint everything as big business was in some ways problematic, but it was true enough that it evoked a very powerful emotion in readers of the Nonpartisan Leader.
Townley crisscrossed the state tirelessly to drum up support for the League and its endorsed candidates. At hundreds of rallies, picnics, speeches, and community meetings, large and small, Townley hammered home the League's message.
There's a revival atmosphere to this. We have photographs of League picnics, of children involved, whole families involved. This is like the days of the Populist Crusade of the 1890s, where whole families would come together despite the weather, despite everything else, to get together. And what happens is not only are they taking part in it, but by seeing all of their neighbors and by seeing neighbors in other townships, they are starting to see themselves as having real power. That these are people who can make real changes, because the Minneapolis Chamber of Commerce might have the money, but they do not have any votes in the state of North Dakota.
A.C. Townley was one of the great organizers in American political history. People ought to know more about him. He was a person who understood that you had to build an organization by giving farmers a newspaper, and you give them entertainment, and you give them a sense of dynamism in campaigns. He was a person who was very modern in his campaign techniques. For instance, he actually had candidates flying around by airplane, and so this kind of sense of excitement and creating an exciting campaign.
Voters flocked to the League's rallies to meet the League-endorsed candidates, but many came just to hear Townley speak.
He's the guy I would have liked to seen speak. This is pre-microphone, pre-radio, and apparently he could stir people. At some point, as a historian, you say, where would I have liked to have been? What would I have liked to have seen? But as far as North Dakota is concerned, I would have liked to have seen and heard the man speak in his prime, because apparently he could charm the birds out of the trees, and he could hold audiences. I just think he'd been a fun guy to hear at some point, just to see how he could hold people for hours.
In its first 6 months, the League recruited 26,000 members. In a year, there were 40,000. And with the primary election on the horizon, momentum continued to build.
It gave farmers a sense of value, self-worth that previous political movements hadn't. The idea of these people traveling up and down the roads of North Dakota in Model T Fords, recruiting neighbors, and it was neighbors recruiting neighbors. It was a genuine grassroots movement, and people gravitated towards it.
The real test for the League is going to be the Maine state election in 1916. The real issue is going to be whether they can win in the Republican Party primary or not. And what's astonishing about what happens is not only do League organizers, are they able to organize the farmers of North Dakota into the League, all of a sudden you have, for the first times in their lives, thousands of farmers and their families coming together, debating who their candidates should be in the primary election.
As North Dakota's primary election day dawned June 28th of 1916, League organizers nervously watched the sky. One of the worst electrical storms in history brought a statewide downpour that threatened all the League's hard work. Rural voters found they couldn't get their wagons out of their own farmyards. Roads were impassable, and rivers and streams so swollen with rain that they couldn't be crossed. As polls closed, wires were down all over the state, and it took a long time for results to begin to trickle in.
What's remarkable in that 1916 campaign, the League itself didn't think they were going to take many districts. It was very, very depressed, and what happens is that the League has not quite, but almost a clean sweep. It is a tremendous, tremendous moment. It's a great victory.
After the unexpected victory in the primary, the fall election was a foregone conclusion. League candidates held all elected offices except state treasurer and had majority control of the House and the Supreme Court, and gained a strong minority in the Senate. It was now time to seize control of the state's destiny and bring the industrial program to life.
Aristotle talks about to be angry is easy, but to be angry at the right person at the right time and for the right purpose. That is not easy, and it's not within everybody's capability. And I think what was different with the Nonpartisan League is that they were able to capture that anger and then put it into a constructive vision in which you think you can win.
Those farmers learned to work together. They learned eventually to vote together as well. When the Nonpartisan League got involved very quickly in its first election, this great election of 1916, there had been criticisms of farmer movements in North Dakota and elsewhere in the plains. Farmers, they were not sophisticated enough. They would never get together because farming, it's an individual family proposition. The idea that they would never be able to stick together to put something together. And so the League came up with this just brilliant slogan, which is, "We'll stick, we'll win." The farmers are realizing that if we're getting these folks to attack us, we must be doing something right. And so even more, they're going to stick together, we're going to stay together, and we're going to make these changes.
The League's success in North Dakota drew the attention of farmers everywhere. Even before the newly elected League officials took office, requests poured in asking for Townley's help organizing the Nonpartisan League in other states.
I think farmers recognized this as an opportunity to get what they needed out of politics. And they saw business people doing it. They saw corporations doing it. So why couldn't they? And of course, that was a central piece of the League pitch. And then once you show the people that they can win, that's real power.
Farmers were not the only ones who recognized what the League's win might mean.
There were rumblings in the press that there was something happening in North Dakota, and it was the editorials in the St. Paul and Minneapolis papers were that something running amok up in North Dakota, and we need to keep an eye on this, make sure it doesn't spread.
Would the League, with no experience running a government, be able to overcome the mighty political machine of the Chamber of Commerce and enact its program of reforms? Could the new political movement do what so many tried and failed? Could the League free North Dakota from the control of out-of-state interests?
There was a vast undercurrent in the political system in North Dakota with people in rural areas who felt they were being cheated by the system. People came here, were given 160 acres of land to homestead, became part of the American system. They got to vote, they could practice their religion, but they were being left out of the economic system.
The League's mandate was to protect farmers from the depredation of big biz, the cartels that were making fortunes at the expense of the farmers.
I think what's amazing, looking back, decades later, is just how brazen the theft was from the farmers in North Dakota. When a farmer showed up with their wheat at the local grain elevator, it was weighed, but a lot of times those scales were rigged, they were crooked. Another thing that happened is there was sort of this miracle in reverse. When a farmer sold a load of wheat, it got graded quite low, graded as number 4 wheat or number 3 wheat. But by the time it made it onto the boxcar heading to Minneapolis, it had become a number 1 grade of wheat. They're creating the world's greatest wheat, and they're barely getting any return on it.
It wasn't just the grain exchange that farmers were fighting. The banking industry in the Twin Cities, New York and Chicago, also had its hands in the pockets of North Dakota farmers.
The interest rates that the bankers were charging were far and above what they ought to have been charging. Even the North Dakota Bankers Association issued a report saying these rates that they're charging the farmers are outrageous. It's really not fair. And so when you have even an institution like the North Dakota Bankers Association saying the bank rates are too high, you have to wonder what's going on.
Not only did they charge very high interest rates to the farmer, but they charged a fee. Say you borrowed $1,000 to put in a crop. By the time you left the bank, you took home only $750. And you paid back that $1,000 plus interest. And it just galled them because they knew what the real interest rate was, and it was exorbitant. And what are you going to do? Not borrow the money? That was a bitter pill.
The Nonpartisan League came to Bismarck prepared to do battle with the forces that had exploited farmers for decades. All eyes turned to the state capitol, where the newly elected legislators, state officials, and Supreme Court justices would carry the League's banner into battle.
The vast majority had absolutely no electoral experience. There were a few who had been localized, like county commissioners and that kind of thing. Some of the other folks had had socialist political experience, but for the most part, they're neophytes.
As the legislators gathered for their pre-session organizing in December of 1916, Townley faced the reality that only a few League candidates had ever served in public office of any kind. Some had never even been inside the state capitol.
Townley and other leaders of the Nonpartisan League had to figure out what to do with these citizen politicians and how to prepare them for the 1917 legislative session. Political observers were watching closely to find out if these citizens were up to the task of participating in government in what many saw as a new way. Townley was able to identify a location in Bismarck, the Northwest Hotel, and essentially create a safe space for these newly elected legislators. And there Townley and Albert Bowen essentially sat down with these newly elected officials and helped them think about procedure and platform and how committees worked and the kind of mechanisms through which they would be able to institute their program. But these were closed meetings, and these closed meetings meant that you needed to show a membership card, not just a membership card that you were a member of the Nonpartisan League, but that you were actually a member of the legislative delegation representing the Nonpartisan League to be able to enter into that hotel. Critics suggested something nefarious was going on here. They suggested that Townley was indoctrinating these citizen politicians, but in fact, it's most likely that they were being geared up to figure out how best to use and how to engage the mechanisms of actual legislative practice.
When they get ready to go into session, they end up meeting, and they would sit together in the evenings before, or at least in the preceding days before an event, and they would talk them out. What was the NPL way to do it? What did it represent? What points did they need to make and such things? But you always heard that it was Townley and helping some of the directing of the party as it developed. Bowen, Fred, and Howard Wood had some involvement, but the one that really seems to catch everyone's attention is Townley, because later on all of the press will be that Townley is this puppet master and he's pulling all the strings behind the game.
William Langer was not one of the original members of the Nonpartisan League. He does have an eye on them because he's watching what they're doing politically in North Dakota among the farmers.
He throws his hat in the ring to run for the Morton County State's Attorney, and he beats out over a dozen other candidates. But Langer, by that personal touch, and again, he had the great gift of gab, he managed to get himself elected by very sound numbers into the state's attorney's job. And immediately he starts going after the Northern Pacific Railroad for failure to pay taxes. So if you can beat up on the railroads, that made you a champion.
Langer is looking for a place to attach his wagon to, his political star. For Langer, this is a question of opportunity. He's not the completely committed true believer or agrarian radical that other members of the League are. After the inaugural, William Langer writes his brother out in Washington State of his observations of the new League and their new administration in Bismarck. And it's fairly cynical. He pretty much tells his brother that he sees a lot of posing and posturing among the new League people in the State House, and that he sees them pretty much as the same group as the ones they just threw out.
An editorial in the St. Paul Saturday Night professed horror at the election of a farmer like Lynn Fraser as governor, since slopping hogs was hardly proper training for a chief executive.
The NPL was simply painted in the worst possible terms. Press out of Minneapolis and St. Paul was definitely anti-NPL from the very beginning. The owners of the papers had vested interests in grain.
Anti-League newspapers like the Grand Forks Herald predicted disaster when the state was being run by well-meaning but misguided citizens, carpetbaggers, and agitators. It wasn't just the press that belittled the League's farmers turned legislators. They were also dismissed and insulted by their fellow legislators.
Those Republicans that had not associated themselves with the League, who were in fact frightened by the rise of the League, as well as the handful of Democrats left in the legislature, they were deeply troubled by the arrival of these citizen politicians, of these people that they imagined as rubes or hicks, people that they thought simply were not fit and would likely be unable to engage in the most basic legislative processes. And of course, that just fueled more anger amongst members of the League, as well as those legislators that were representing the Nonpartisan League had been elected by their colleagues back in their home districts to institute the League's platform. And so that probably actually created more cohesion for the Nonpartisan League legislators in that first legislative session, these very public attacks on whether or not just their credibility, but whether or not they simply had the ability to engage in this work of legislating.
The League had campaigned on the promise of establishing a program of state-owned industries that would free North Dakota's farmers from out-of-state interests.
In the 1916 election, Townley and Company, the NPL, had made some broad suggestions about what they wanted to do, and that's when you start to get what newspapers refer to, and even some historians refer to it as 5 bills to state socialism.
It sounded like a simple plan, but it was anything but. In order to bring the dream of state-owned industries to life, it would be necessary to amend the state constitution.
We are still, today, using the vast majority of the Constitution as it was prepared in 1889. As I understand it, it is the oldest functioning state constitution. So there's some things in there that were put in by railroads, business interests that helped to write it that may not be best for the average person, might not even know what's in there.
Prior to the League taking power, amending the Constitution was a lengthy and difficult process, and even when ratified by the voters, could be overturned by the state Supreme Court. League leaders came up with an idea that was fast, efficient, and totally without precedent. Instead of amending the Constitution, they introduced House Bill 44, which would replace the entire thing with a version that was more League-friendly.
The 1917 legislature, all of what the NPL stood for, they had put into one big bill. It's probably one of the most significant bills ever in North Dakota's legislative history. It's House Bill number 44. And it was declared to be a Declaration of Rights for the farmer.
One of the big changes was to allow the state to enter business, and also, as I understand it, to allow the state to go into indebtedness for assorted projects. If you're planning on a mill, an elevator, a bank, and all those kind of things, You're going to be going into business, and that business is probably going to cost you a few dollars. Without those changes, you could have accomplished very little, but with the Supreme Court change, with those folks interpreting the changes, well, other things become possible.
Perhaps the most important thing to come out of 1917 was the debate over what's known as House Bill 44. League legislators made this the kind of centerpiece of their work, and there was incredible resistance to this, both in the minority in the House as well as in the Senate. And in the Senate, of course, the Nonpartisan League did not quite have control. And of course, they were able to make the claim that these were very, very significant changes, essentially constitutional changes, being made to the laws of North Dakota, and that perhaps they should not be so sweeping given their significance. With that in mind, and because it was not in the interest of the Republican Party, that part of it that hadn't been taken over by the Nonpartisan League already, to support the League's platform, senators in particular made their stand.
While attacking the bill in the press and on the floor, opponents also began a campaign of delaying tactics.
The North Dakota Constitution has a specific number of days that the state legislature can meet, and I believe at that time it was 60 days, and it's every 2 years. And a lot of stuff gets delayed in committees. The Senate was quite aware of that. This House bill was sent kind of as a package, and House passes it. Gets to the Senate, and the Senate braces its feet, and it never comes to pass.
League opponents reacted with predictable venom. They claimed the League was attempting to abolish private property rights, install socialism as the law of the land, and to undermine morality, intelligence, and the very foundations of the American way of life. Killing House Bill 44 was not the only action the Senate took against the League. They attempted to take the wind out of the League's sails by reviving the old equity dream of a state-owned terminal elevator.
Farmers realized they needed to have a farmers-owned or farmer-controlled terminal elevator. This is the way that farmers could directly sell their grain to actually the flour mills. They could help bypass some of these middlemen along the way who were setting the price of the grain and were taking their profit.
In the final days of the session, the Senate rammed through a token bill to build a small terminal elevator using money raised for the failed 1915 proposal. The bill was presented to the House for a vote. The League caucus was divided.
Well, it's not exactly what the NPL had asked for, and it's also only part of the program.
The bill passed and the session adjourned. The bill now came to the desk of Governor Lynn Fraser.
The Equity Alliance idea. Equity Alliance is one, but again, it probably wasn't the most effective solution. We don't have that monopoly power, that economic power that the Nonpartisan League would have given us. So it wasn't going to solve all their problems.
If he signs the elevator bill, there's at least a reasonable chance that the Industrial Commission, the Hail Insurance, the Home Builders Association, that they'll never come to pass. And his choice is half a bite of the apple or none of the apple. And he chooses none of the apple.
Despite the defeat of House Bill 44, the League's first legislative season was not all failure. The League held rallies around the state defending the governor's veto. Even Farmers' Equity came to support Fraser's decision. But even though the League was unsuccessful getting the industrial program passed, the new political movement achieved a great deal in its first session.
1917 is a stunning success as a legislative session. We end up with such crazy things as the ability to recall an ill-behaved member of this government on any level in the state. We hadn't had that before. We also amend the referendum and initiative proposals, which are in the initial Constitution, but the number of folks required to call a referendum or to start an initiative, 25% of the voting population down to only 10% of the voting population. So the theory in principle is that you're expanding the power of the people. I believe you could say the same thing with the passing of women's suffrage, that you're expanding the electorate. Up until that time, women could only vote in school elections. And the great picture of when Lynn Fraser is signing this piece of paperwork, one of the elders who'd been working pretty much since the 1880s is on one side of him as he's signing the paperwork, and on the other side is about a 10, 12-year-old girl. And that 10, 12-year-old girl happens to be Townley's stepdaughter, Bonita. And it's just kind of a wonderful image of the elderly woman who's fought most of her life to this young child whose world is going to be changing. There's also some elements about how long women can work. It doesn't say anything about a woman on the farm. She can work until she drops. It's really a very progressive legislature. It's not a failure. They might not have got the big prize, but they certainly changed the way our state looks 100 years later.
Now it was time to concentrate on building voter support for 10 constitutional amendments that would do the job House Bill 44 was meant to accomplish. During the spring and summer of 1917, League meetings were held continuously throughout the state. Picnics and rallies were held in every county in the state, with headquarters providing speakers to consolidate voter support for the constitutional amendments and maintain their interest in the League's program. But during this time of consolidation, Townley's focus had begun to shift.
Because the victory came very quickly in North Dakota, within a year and a half, suddenly they are beleaguered by pleas to come organize us from farmers all across the country, not just in other parts of the West, but in the South and even parts of the East Coast. They see that there is potential for something bigger. And I think Townley's entrepreneurial spirit kicks in, and he sees that if the Nonpartisan League can control politics in North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana, and Minnesota, because western Minnesota is still a really important wheat growing area at that point. Essentially, the Nonpartisan League would control the wheat belt. And controlling the wheat belt meant having a really big card to play in national politics.
In the spring of 1917, the Nonpartisan League went larger than just one state. And since it was already moving into Minnesota, they moved their headquarters from Fargo to St. Paul and became the National Nonpartisan League.
So moving to Minneapolis to St. Paul, or moving in particular to St. Paul in 1917, is central. You go into the heart of the beast to slay the beast. The League had a lot of money by then. They could do it. They rented the 5th floor of the Endicott building, which is one of the most important office buildings in St. Paul. It was a way of signaling, we have arrived. We are for real. You need to take us seriously.
Not all League members were as enthusiastic about becoming a national organization as Townley was. Chief among them was Attorney General William Langer. Langer believed the League needed to keep its focus on building the industrial program in North Dakota, and not on what he came to see as Townley's personal political empire.
The break came on matters of substance, and the personalities are added. And also, Townley is a self-described socialist, and Bill Langer never was. He was an NPLer. It wasn't personal dislike, but the idea of the NPL expanding met with some serious resistance.
Despite the fractures that were developing with Langer and other League officials, Townley pushed on with his plans. Meanwhile, back in North Dakota, League enemies began a campaign to discredit the NPL program, using the League's roots against them. On April 11th, the Anti-Socialist League formed in Grand Forks to discuss how to combat the red menace that was the NPL.
They had to fight being branded as Bolsheviks, as revolutionaries, as socialists, as communists. This is from Cathro, who is the first president of the North Dakota Bankers Association. He talks about North Dakotans and he says, "Our people have resented injustice, but have never revolted in a way that indicates a spirit of red revolution. They resort to the constitutional ballot for the redress of their grievances. They are sober-minded, studious, and industrious, and give careful consideration to the economic problems and decide carefully and wisely. There's no tendency towards anarchy, but the people are law-abiding, with no large industrial center, no large mining towns, and no large congestions of population. There's no chance for the propagation of Bolshevism or IWWism, but to the contrary, the homes of our people are scattered and spread out over an area of over 70,000 square miles. And really, they're just simply farmers who wanted a fair shake.
It did not help that Townley, Fraser, and other League leaders spoke out against entering what President Woodrow Wilson called Europe's War, a position League opponents said proved the League was secretly Bolshevik and socialist.
Townley had begun to question our involvement and had been speaking out against involvement in the war, claiming it was a rich man's thing. It's just big biz, it's the rich, the wealthy. They're the ones that want to get us into war because it's going to benefit only them. It's not going to benefit you, the farmer of North Dakota, you, the common person of North Dakota. Very much playing into that, us versus them mentality.
Once America entered the war in 1917, the League announced its support for the war effort, but opponents claimed it was too little, too late.
The Nonpartisan League tried to hold on to two things that seemed problematic to many outsiders at the time. Before America's entry into World War I, the Nonpartisan League had been against any kind of involvement in the European conflict, as had President Woodrow Wilson, most of the members of his party, and a broad majority of the American people. When war is declared in the spring of 1917, the Nonpartisan League decides to try to take on a nuanced approach. They proclaim their loyalty to the United States, they proclaim their loyalty to the war effort, but they're also anxious to avoid various forms of profiteering that can emerge as a country gears up for war.
The Nonpartisan League supported the war, but they demanded that sacrifices be equal. For example, there was a cap on the price of wheat, but there was none on the price of flour. So the millers could make as much money as, enormous wartime profits, but the farmers didn't get any benefit from that.
By the start of the war, the League had expanded into 11 states and 2 Canadian provinces.
They had an incredibly ambitious vision. St. Paul was going to be a headquarters. They sent organizers as far south as Texas and as far west as Washington. They created a second party in Idaho called the Progressive Party, but they wanted to essentially move from North Dakota and Minnesota west and as far as possible south, and they did.
Having seen what the League had accomplished in North Dakota, opponents were prepared for battle to keep the League from getting a foothold.
They feared the League. The fact that the Nonpartisan League had been able to make such gains in 1916 in the elections, the statewide elections in North Dakota, it sent a clear signal to politicians across the West that this was something they should be concerned about. They were very careful to watch for word of organizers coming in, whether they were Nonpartisan League employees or if they were just farmers who had gotten the idea and were really interested and were inviting the Nonpartisan League employees in. They were very anxious to find out about meetings. They were very anxious to find out about the emergence of newspapers that would start to take a kind of Nonpartisan League orientation on their editorial page. Places like Idaho and Montana and South Dakota and Minnesota, Nebraska, even Kansas. They're watching what's happening in North Dakota very closely because the effectiveness of this technique, this nonpartisan technique of creating an organization that works in the open direct primary, had proven so powerful.
During the war, while the League in North Dakota was able to continue strengthening its support, in other states it was fighting for its life, especially in Minnesota.
In 1917, when the United States entered the war, the state of Minnesota reacted by, first of all, passing a public safety commission, which had the authority to do, quote, everything necessary and proper to protect the public safety, which was very shortly interpreted to mean try to stop dissent, because they were afraid of losing their political power because they had heard that the Nonpartisan League was starting to organize, and that was a threat to them.
The National Guard is called up during World War I, and in Minnesota it's replaced by the Public Safety Commission with this Home Guard, made up of men in their 30s and 40s, who are volunteers, who are armed, and who are meant to ensure that public order is kept. And therefore, in Minnesota in 1917 and 1918, you get a variety of civil liberties that are trampled on. There's an instance in Pine County where a group of the Home Guards would threaten to attack a farmer's house because they were fearful that a League meeting was happening there and that there was an organizer staying with this farm family. There was a parade in Anoka in which Nonpartisan League families had a meeting and then drove through town, and they were not just assaulted by a mob, but assaulted by Home Guards, and women were pulled out of cars. And the League was very careful to use or to deploy these instances in which constitutional rights were denied in order to kind of boost for the organization. Because as these accusations, and often they were worthwhile, legitimate accusations, as they piled up, it became clear to a lot of people that the League was being persecuted.
They were disrupting meetings all the time. The fact that you can't hold a meeting, and that if you speak out, you're going to get into trouble with them, would certainly be what is lawyers call it, constitutional lawyers call it, chilling effect. They're not going to do it.
The story was the same throughout the expansion states. Wartime patriotic fervor was used to suppress League organizers and defeat League candidates for state offices. Even well-respected Minnesota Congressman C.A. Lindbergh lost the governor's race to an unpopular Republican incumbent.
As far as political success goes, the Nonpartisan League in the election, the primary, did not do very well. Lindbergh carried 30 counties. Well, there are 87 counties in Minnesota. After that, it fell apart.
I think that in a larger context, that the lifespan of the Nonpartisan League in its original incarnation was terminated. It came to an end with the defeat of the NPL in the Minnesota elections in 1918. So when they lose in Minnesota, the League is bottled up almost on a reservation in North Dakota.
It seemed clear the League's future was in North Dakota. Throughout the summer of 1918, Townley and other League leaders campaigned tirelessly across the state to re-elect League candidates and pass the package of constitutional amendments that would allow the League to implement its industrial program.
Opposition to the League in the wake of World War I emerges in a number of different forms. First of all, it emerges from party politicians who are working to ensure that this non-party organization cannot take power and institute its program. And they bring in the big guns. William Howard Taft, who's between jobs at that point, he had been president, was soon to be on the U.S. Supreme Court, also went after the Nonpartisan League, once again because he was a dedicated Republican Party stalwart. Theodore Roosevelt, before he passes away, becomes a real powerful critic of the Nonpartisan League. He publicly goes after the League in his newspaper column, which is syndicated through the Kansas City Star.
He goes on a bond tour in October of 1918, and he is just rabid on the NPL, an organization he had at least moderately supported 2 or 3 years earlier. He gives a speech in Montana that is just strikingly vehement about how horrible the NPL is, how horrible socialism is. He attacks Townley, and he says, in essence, the NPL members, the leadership, should be lined up against a wall and shot.
In the fall of 1918, despite the accusations, despite Teddy Roosevelt, despite the Chamber's political influence, North Dakota voters went to the polls and made the League's slogan come true again. We'll stick.
It's phenomenal when you think that they weren't educated. They're mostly immigrants, mostly living in poverty. They were able to create an institution like this that went against the entire grain and be successful. It's pretty phenomenal.
The League now had almost total control of North Dakota government. All but one elected official were Leaguers. 4 out of 5 Supreme Court justices, 3/4 of the Senate, and a 70% majority in the House. But more importantly, all 10 of the League's constitutional amendments were overwhelmingly approved by voters. At the start of the 1919 legislative session, it looked as though nothing could stop the League from implementing its reforms.
In North Dakota during those years, politics was no longer something that other people figured out. This was just regular folks on the ground level getting together and determining how their government was going to look. They've given us a different kind of model for getting things done politically, and it's one that I think we can all learn from.
But the League's success did not mean there were blue skies ahead. Before the ink on the election results was even dry, storm clouds were gathering on the horizon.
Production funding for the Rise and Fall of the Nonpartisan League is provided in part by the North Dakota Humanities Council, a nonprofit independent state partner of the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Minnesota Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund, with money from the vote of the people of Minnesota on November 4th, 2008, and by the members of Prairie Public.
To purchase a DVD copy of the complete 3-hour series of The Rise and Fall of the Nonpartisan League, including bonus features, call 1-800-359-6900 or order online at www.prairiepublic.org.